You can organize the Bible around 4 words, 4 terms. Term 1 is creation. That's Genesis 1 and 2. The second word is rebellion. That's Genesis 3 through 11. And that helps us to understand the thoroughgoing nature of that rebellion, starting with Adam and Eve, of course, in Genesis 3, but then going through the Cainite civilization, not Canaanite, Cainite, the descendants of Cain, who murdered Abel, as you know. And you see, as you study that carefully, the self-destructive nature of the Cainite civilization. So God made a decision. I'm going to start all over with Noah and his sons. So God sends the flood. And then you see in chapter 9 and 10 and 11, things aren't much better. Noah's drunk. You see all the sin of Ham and the curse on Cain and his son. And then you see the Tower of Babel, where the descendants of Noah, his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, refuse to obey what God wants them to do, which is spread out and populate the earth. They build the Tower of Babel. God then confuses them with multiple languages, and they are forced to spread out. And you see in the table of nations where the 3 sons of Noah go. And then chapter 12 begins the third word, redemption. And Genesis 12 through Revelation 20 is the theme of redemption. God's redemptive plan, what he promised in Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman, from the seed of the woman will come one who will crush the head of the serpent. And it begs that question through the Old Testament. Where's the serpent crusher? Who is it? And so with Genesis 12, you see God's changing something. He chooses a man, Abraham. Abram is his initial name, and he calls him out of Mesopotamia, and he makes him a 3-fold promise: land, seed, and blessing. From you, Abraham, your heritage, your children, your grandchildren, your entire group of people that will come from your loins will be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore. And I will give you land. And he defines the boundary of that land in Genesis 17. And in you, all the nations will be blessed. Well, that helps us to understand a little more clarity, give a little more clarity to Genesis 3:15's promise. But boy, it's still so broad. And then you see there's Isaac, his son. And then you see his son is Jacob. And Jacob gives, through 4 women, gives birth to 12 sons. And it's in Judah, in the promise that Jacob makes before he dies in Genesis 49. Judah, from your lineage, the scepter will never depart. The fourth word is restoration, and that's Revelation 21 and 22. The new heaven and the new earth. What was lost in Adam, Eden, is restored in Jesus. But this redemptive program, it's so complex. And you go through the Old Testament, you're trying to figure out what in the world is going on. Where is this theme? How do we pick this up? Well, that's kind of what we want to try to do in these next 7 weeks. I told Pastor Matt what I wanted to do. He approved it, and then I started studying. I thought, I must have been out of my mind to try to do this. I really mean it. The more I've tried to get to the point where I'm ready to do it, I was ready to do it about 8 minutes ago, so I think we're ready to go here. But as you remember, the children of Jacob, the children of Israel, Genesis 32, his name is changed to Israel. Not Jacob, the heel catcher, the conniver, the manipulator. He's now the one who struggles with God, Israel. So from here on out, they will be called the children of Israel. Well, as you know, in 1876 BC, one of the children of Jacob, Joseph, has been thrown into slavery, sold into that by his brothers who were jealous of him. He ends up in Egypt, and by the providence of God, he becomes the second most powerful man in that great ancient civilization of Egypt. And as I mentioned, in 1876 BC, Jacob and his clan go down to Egypt, and for the next 430 years, That clan becomes a nation, if we follow the census of Numbers in Deuteronomy, 2 million plus people. And after 430 years of slavery, Moses leads them out of Egypt, down to Mount Sinai, and they receive the moral law of God. And they receive the ceremonial procedures of how God is going to take care of their sin through the sacrificial system, which atones for sin, enabling Israel to walk with God, not only the Creator, not only the Deliverer, but their Redeemer, their Goel. Then under Joshua, that second major promise, the seed, you start to see it with the birth of the nation in Egypt, 2 million plus people. Under Joshua, they got the second part. They get the land. And that's the book of Joshua, the conquest. And then you see near the end of the book of Joshua, the 12 tribes receive their land grants. Each one receives a little chunk of land, and the boundaries are clearly defined in the book of Joshua. But there's no unity in the nation. There's no capital. The closest thing to a capital is Shiloh in the Ephraim land grant, where the tabernacle is. But there's no king, there's no political leader. It's a decentralized nation of Israel. And that's where you study the book of Judges. And Judges is an incredibly fascinating book because you see the 12 tribes decentralized, dispersed. They're not unified, and they're constantly falling into idolatry, that little cycle that you see. And the book of Judges ends with this haunting phrase. It's really a clause. There is no king in Israel, and every man is doing what is right in his own eyes. It's a catastrophe. And the actual survival of God's covenant people is in jeopardy. Not quite certain when you leave the book of Judges, where in the world is this going? And what about the promise of Genesis 3:15? What about the promise of blessing in Genesis 12:3 that God made to Abraham? And that's where we pick up with the monarchy. Because the monarchy, which I want to study today and next week, is the establishment of a king that will bring unity to the 12 tribes and will begin to fulfill that promise of being a blessing to the world. I want to talk about that. And the booklet that you've received is a resource. I am not going to go through every single page of that booklet. But I've given it to you. I spent a lot of time putting this together, but I'm giving it to you as a resource for you to use. Because listen, if you do not understand the monarchy, you do not understand the Old Testament. Because just think of how the Old Testament is organized. You have the first 5 books, the Torah, the law, whatever you want to call it, but they're incredibly important books. But then you have the history books. You have 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They're all about the monarchy. And then you have the other history books like Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah, which are about the Israelites that go into captivity, and they're under the Babylonian Empire and the Persian Empire, but then they come back. But that's all the complexity of what's happening to God's covenant people. How do the prophets fit in here? We have 4 major prophets, and you have 12 minor prophets. They're all written during the monarchy. Now, the last 3, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are when they come back from the exile. But they're all about this monarchy issue, the kings, the rulers of Israel. And the prophets speak to the oracles of God to the king and the oracles of God to the people. They become the champions of what God is doing through his covenant people, what his ideal is for them as his covenant people. So what we are going to do is we're going to take the first 2 sessions, today and next Sunday, to deal with the establishment of the monarchy, how God changes the theocratic system of his covenant people. He ruled them directly through the Levites. But as he establishes the monarchy, God now uses the king as a mediator. He will mediate the covenant blessings to his covenant people. That's what we want to talk about. And then when we get those first two kind of historical overview, we're going to look at the prophets. And I want to establish clearly in your understanding of the 4 major prophets and the 12 minor prophets, what was their role in the kingdom? What are they saying to the people? It would be oracles of judgment, but continual, constant oracles of promise. We're going to talk about that in the 3rd week. And then when we're done with that, we're going to look at Jonah. We're going to spend 4 weeks on Jonah. Now, I've chosen Jonah. In you, all the nations will be blessed. Because the covenant nation of Israel was to be, let's use a modern term, the missionaries to the ancient world. They were to show the ancient world what a covenant people looks like if they walk with the one true and only God, the Creator, the Deliverer, the Redeemer. And as you know, Jonah gets the call to go to the largest and most important city in the ancient empire of Assyria, Nineveh. And he accepts that call, right? No, he goes in the opposite direction. And that's the theme of Jonah. It's crucial. And we'll spend 4 weeks on that. So are you ready to get started?
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't expect that kind of a response. That's good. It either means you know what I'm doing or get clear, Eckman, so we can get into it. Let's start with Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20. As you know, the book of Deuteronomy means second law. That's what Deuteronomy means in Greek language. But this is the second generation. Most of the first generation had died in the wilderness wanderings for 40 years. So they're about ready to head into the promised land, and Moses just reviews everything. But he says something in Deuteronomy 17. He talks about the king. He talks about the monarchy. When you go into the land, remember the theme at the end of the book of Judges, there's no king in Israel, every man's doing what is right in his own eyes. Well, the people want a king, but they want a king like all the other nations. That's not exactly the way God wants it, but he will permit that. But he establishes the king will be someone that I choose, the Lord your God chooses. And I want to read that next cluster of sentences in the first paragraph. This shift in the theocracy established at the time of the Exodus to the monarchy centered on Saul, David, and Solomon. We're going to study those 3. It was a tectonic shift, for it involved the shift from Shiloh, where the tabernacle was, to Jerusalem, the capital city of the empire. From charismatic judges, the book of Judges, to an eternal kingship. I want to talk about that adjective, eternal, in just a little bit. That is a key to understanding Genesis 3:15 and Genesis 12:3. It is the kingship that God is establishing that is an eternal kingship that will mediate the covenant blessings to God's covenant people. And as you know, because you and I have the books of the New Testament, that's about Jesus. He's the King of kings and Lord of lords. And then thirdly, from the 12 tribes, think of Joshua in the book of Judges, to a unified nation with a king and a capital, the king mediating the covenant blessings to the covenant people of God in their covenant land. The monarchy begins with Saul, a king like all other nations, who was replaced by David, a man after God's own heart, who was succeeded by his son Solomon, who at first sought wisdom, great in the early chapters of 1 Kings, but ended his rule in debauchery and idolatry. As you study that, you can hardly believe what happens to Solomon. The monarchy demonstrated, this is a very important cluster of sentences here. The monarchy of Israel demonstrated once again Israel's need for a righteous shepherd king who would lead them in covenant obedience to God. It's a very important sentence. Saul, David, and Solomon all had special gifts, but they ultimately failed as king. From the perspective of Scripture, the 66 books of the Bible, only King Jesus meets perfectly the needs for the righteous shepherd king. Here is Deuteronomy 17. Let's read it. You will note here on the slide, I believe you have a copy of this in your booklet as well, but I have 5 numbers. They're in blue, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want to read this. When you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and they say, I will set a king over me like all the nations around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. Yahweh Elohim, the covenant title of God. On from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Second, he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. 3, he shall not acquire many wives for himself. 4, lest his heart turn away. 4, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive gold and silver. And when he sits on the throne of the kingdom, 5th requirement, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, Yahweh Elohim, by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either the right hand or the left, that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. Now, for you to understand the history books of the Old Testament, for you to understand the oracles of the prophet, you must keep coming back to Deuteronomy 17. This is God's ideal for the king. And what becomes clear as you study the monarchy, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you read all the prophets who are commenting on what the kings are doing, nobody's doing this. Nobody's fulfilling these requirements, at least perfectly and completely and holistically. And that's why the prophets start talking about a coming anointed one of God. And the Hebrew for anointed is Messiah, Messiah. And we leave the Old Testament not knowing who that is. Who is the anointed one? Who is going to restore the Davidic monarchy? Who is going to lead and shepherd his covenant people in righteousness and justice? What's the first verse of the New Testament? This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. Now we know. So in a very real sense, in what we're going to be studying these next 7 weeks, it's all pointing ultimately to Jesus. And you're going to see the failure of even David to live up to what God's ideal is. In this covenant reorganization, if I can use that term, this covenant reorganization of the theocracy. So this chart, which you have a copy of, kind of summarizes what this was supposed to look like. Before the king, there was no king here. It was just Yahweh, the Levitical priest, and the people of Israel. But let's review this real quickly. Let's start first. Here's Yahweh. That's his covenant name. He gives them the law, and it is the responsibility of the Levitical priests to teach the law to the people. Now remember, the Levites do not get a land grant. When you study Joshua, they don't get a land grant. They get 48 Levitical cities. And one of the responsibilities of the Levites was to teach the people the law. If you study the geography of that, we don't have the time to do that in the focus we're giving these 7 weeks, but you will see that wherever an Israelite lived, they were less than 10 miles from a Levitical city. And that becomes really important. Are the Levites doing what they're supposed to do? When you study the book of Judges, you see, no, they're not. But that's another study. So that's part of the responsibility. The other part of the responsibility of the Levites was to administer the sacrificial system, which is the importance of the ark. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, all of those things that you read about when you study the tabernacle and how God atoned for sin through the sacrifice of animals and so on. But the Levitical priests were the crucial part of this theocratic system. But then God permits Israel to get a king because they demand a king like other nations. That's not necessarily the way to God. But God did want them to have a king, because ultimately that king will be Jesus. But the king is really crucial in this reorganization of theocracy. But the king is to mediate the covenant blessings to the people. Partially because the Levites weren't doing what they were supposed to do. But even though they are doing, in many cases, what they're supposed to do, at least in some years, the king is to be that mediator between God and the people. And that becomes really crucial when you understand the role of Jesus as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's also, I'm thinking now of what's in the book of Hebrews, he's also our high priest. And he mediates his covenant blessings through his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. And his sending of the Holy Spirit, which is the sign of the new covenant, which is promised in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, prophets of the Old Testament. So this is really crucial to understand this diagram, what is going on in so much of the Old Testament. If you don't understand this, you don't understand the role of the king in mediating the covenant blessings of God to his covenant people, you don't understand why the prophets keep telling the people and telling the king through these oracles what they are supposed to be doing. And if they don't do it, God will discipline them, including even sending them into exile. Now, we're going to pick up speed, because Pastor Matt does not want me to go till 12:30. So we're going to pick up speed. You have all of this written in your booklet. But I want to review Saul and his failure. And then I want to review David. David will become the king through which every king of Judah is measured. When you look at the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, particularly 1st and 2nd Chronicles, every king of Judah is measured against David. He did what was right in the eyes of God, just like his father David. He did not do what was right in the eyes of his God, unlike his father David. So David's really crucial. We'll get to that in just a minute. Let's talk about Saul. And again, I'm going to summarize a lot of this. It's written out in your notes. Saul was the first king of the United Kingdom of Israel. He was anointed by the prophet Samuel, and he reigned from Gibeah. That was his hometown. That was the early capital of the kingdom. As you know, he committed suicide to avoid capture at the Battle of Mount Gilboa in the Jezreel Valley when he was defeated by the Philistines. The succession of the throne was contested by his surviving son, but his son-in-law David, because remember, David married one of the daughters of Saul, who eventually prevailed. Now, let's work through this in summary. When you read those early chapters about Saul in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel, you say, wow, he looks like a good guy. He was regal. He came from a good family. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. He was physically very strong. He was tall. He stood out. And you look at it, hey, that's the kind of king that Israel needs. He did manifest kind of a degree of humility, which is one of the characteristics of a good king according to the standards and virtues of God. But he had a character flaw. What did Deuteronomy 17 say? The king is to write a copy of the law. The Levitical priests are to look at it and approve it. He is to meditate on it. He is to internalize it. It's to become a part of his heart, not only his mind. He is to be governed by, energized by, empowered by the verbal revelation of God in the law. Saul did not do that. Saul was a man of fear, not a man of faith. That's the difference between him and David. This is just, there's a lot on this, but you have a copy of it. I put it in your notebook just to illustrate two things. These are all the children of Jacob to the four women. Rachel, of course, gives birth to Joseph and to Benjamin, her last child, and Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. Judah, who was born to Leah, is, of course, one of the children. He will be, from Judah will come King David and ultimately Jesus. This is just really important to understand the difference between Saul and David at this point. Now, what I want to do here is, and this chart is just a summary of the book of Samuel. When you see the promise of him, he's appointed king, his failure as a king, and he's rejected as king. That's what I want to look at. Why does God reject him? Well, the fall of Saul occurs in two different stages. I'll come back to that map in a minute. When you read in those early chapters, like chapter 9 and chapter 10 of 1 Samuel, God had this primary objective for Saul. Because as you can see from this map, the nemesis of Israel at this time were the Philistines. This today, we would call this the Gaza Strip for the most part. This is where the Philistines lived. And they constantly raided into Judah, into Benjamin, and they start heading into the northern tribes as well, their land grants. They're a very difficult people. They're a thorn in the flesh of Israel. And Saul had the responsibility, by God's directive, neutralize the threat of the Philistines. Now this leads to stage one of his collapse, his fall. The Philistines have been creating all kinds of difficulties for Saul. Samuel said, now listen, what I want you to do is I want you to wait. I will come at Gilgal, which was kind of an important city, an important community. Wait there, but what does Saul do? He offers sacrifices. Saul takes on the role of a priest. Now, the king is not supposed to do that, but Saul does that. So why does God reject Saul and his dynasty? Because stage one is God says, I'm pulling my blessing from your dynasty. None of your children, none of your sons are going to be king. You're the last king of your dynasty. Eugene Merrill in his book argues, quote, this is in the second paragraph, Saul's failure then lay in his appropriating to himself priestly prerogatives which may have been associated with pagan kingship, but which, without specific divine sanction, were inappropriate to him or to any king of Israel. There's a clear separation between the king and the high priest. Saul is trying to manipulate, control the blessings of God. I want your blessing, God, my way. I'm not going to wait for Samuel. What was the king to do according to Deuteronomy 17? Immerse himself in the verbal revelation of God. Understand who God is, understand who you are, understand who God's covenant people are, and how you are to mediate the covenant blessings to my people. You are not to take on the role of a high priest. The second stage is more devastating. When you go back to Deuteronomy 25, God had made it very clear, saying this to Moses. The Amalekites have been a tremendous problem for Israel. They did not in any way help Moses as he's leading the tribes up to cross the Jordan River. As a matter of fact, the Amalekites were horrible to Israel. God said, I'm going to deal with them. I'm going to destroy them. I'm going to judge them. I'm going to put them under the ban. Saul, you are the one to do that. Samuel makes it very clear what he's supposed to do. So they have this huge battle with the Amalekites. It's a tremendous victory for Israel. And what does Saul do? Because to put them under the ban, he was to destroy everything, including the king, Agag. So what does Saul do? Well, they save some of the best animals. They save 2 pizza shops. They have a peanut butter ice cream store. And then he preserves the king, Agag. And finally Samuel comes, and Samuel says, "What do I hear, King Saul? The bleating of animals, where did they come? Oh, the people made me do that." And when you go through the dialogue between Samuel and Saul, Saul refuses to accept responsibility for his self-centered, self-indulgent actions. Good night. He even built a monument to himself for the glorious victory over the Philistines. And Samuel says to Saul, "You did not obey your God. You are the mediator of covenant blessings to your people. You did not do that. You acted out of selfish, self-centered, self-indulgent motivations." God desires obedience, not sacrifice. And the text makes it very clear in verse 14 of chapter 16. The Spirit of Yahweh departed from Saul. His dynasty would end with him because of his disobedience to the clear directive about the Amalekites. He's lost the kingdom. The covenant king will not come through the tribe of Benjamin. And what the Bible does is as soon as the Spirit departs from Saul, the Spirit comes upon David. David is, of course, the son of Jesse, from the little town of Bethlehem. David had been a shepherd. And as you know, the whole story of David starts with this tremendous victory over the Philistines, that continued nemesis to Israel. In the story in chapter 17 of Goliath. And David, I love that story in chapter 17. David comes on the scene, sent from his dad, Jesse, to bring some food to the brothers who were there as a part of the military fortress against the Philistines. They're standing in the valley of Elah. And David, how are you guys, why aren't you doing that? Uncircumcised Philistine is challenging the covenant God of Israel. How dare you not do anything? Give me a sling. And as you know, he puts with his sling a stone right in the center of Goliath's head. He falls over and David cuts off his head. That uncircumcised Philistine is fighting the armies of the living God. Now it's really interesting as you study that passage, you would think, well, now David's going to be king because Samuel anoints him in a private ceremony. But David's not ready to be king. And what's going to happen is he's going to be brought into the court of Saul. He's going to play the music to soothe Saul's paranoia. But then Saul's going to turn him in. And for 10 years, Saul chases David around the Judean wilderness, tried to kill him. What I think is important is you look at the argument of 2 Samuel. I don't think, as I recall, this is not in your packet, but all this does is, here you see the rise of David, and then in chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel, the hinge chapters of the book. This is his sin with Bathsheba and the consequence, then his decline. So you start to say, wait a minute. David is a man after God's own heart, but he too has a character flaw. He is a man of faith, unlike Saul, who was a man of fear, paranoia even. But David has a lust problem. It seems that every time David sees a woman he likes, he takes her as his wife. Deuteronomy 17. You shall not take many wives. Covenant failure. But David's the king that still is a model in this sense. Even when he sins, he comes back to his God in repentance. And God forgives and restores. But David must live with the consequences of his sin. What is important in the development of David's character is a threefold development. First, his relationship with Jonathan, then his relationship with Saul, then his relationship with God. Jonathan is the son of Saul. Jonathan, in a sense then, just being very technical, is the heir to the Saul dynasty. But Jonathan understood what God had done to his dad. So Jonathan is loyal to David. It's one of the great stories of the Old Testament. Despite everything that Jonathan could have been jealous, seeking to undermine David, siding with his dad who desires to kill David, Jonathan supports, encourages, edifies, builds up David. God uses Jonathan in David's life to encourage him when he's at his lowest points. What about his relationship with Saul? As I mentioned just a moment ago, Saul brought him into his court, brought David into his court, but because of jealousy and this irrational paranoia which drives so much of Saul's motivation, he sees David as a threat. He hears the people sing, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. Well, that's not an exciting message for Saul to hear from the people, the covenant people of God. And so he wants to kill him. And it's really interesting to study those chapters, that 10-year period, as Saul chases David all around the Judean wilderness. What's God doing? He's developing David's character. He's teaching him the importance of faith. Trust me, David. I promised you you'd be king. Samuel anointed you as king. Do you believe that? And secondly, he's developing David's leadership skills. Because David is learning so much in his being chased by Saul of the skills he needs to lead the covenant people of God. The elders meet every month here at our church for their monthly meetings. And each one of those, Pastor Matt asked me to do a devotional, usually about 15, 20 minutes. But this past almost, a year and a half cycle or whatever we run this, we studied David from that vantage point. What is God teaching David as God is developing his character, developing his faith, developing his leadership skills? That was a fun thing for me to put together for the elders. Because it's showing that what looks like, why didn't David become king right after he defeated Goliath and Samuel anointed him king? Because he wasn't ready to be king. You see, leaders are always called to a higher standard. And the king of Israel needs to be taking Deuteronomy 17, taking God's law, his verbal revelation to humanity, internalizing it, making it a part of his heart, learning what it means to trust in the living God, the covenant God of Israel, learning what it means to have faith in him, to depend on him. And you see that in David. In the 70-plus Psalms that he wrote, of the 150 Psalms, David wrote about half of them. And when you study those Psalms, you see the heart of David, even when he sinned. Even when he sinned, he comes back with God, pouring out his heart to God, asking his forgiveness, and he's restored. David was indeed a man after God's own heart. And that relationship with God is deepened as he learns all that God wants him to learn in those 10 plus years. And when you study that period as well, you see David took 400 men who were disenfranchised, debt-ridden. Saul had exploited them, and David takes them and forms it into the core of his army, which he will use, because it will be David that will defeat the Philistines. It will be David that will neutralize all the enemies of Israel. And that's why when you get to 2 Samuel chapter 7, you see a huge turning point in biblical history. You have the Abrahamic covenant, an unconditional unilateral covenant God makes with Abraham, the beginning of the Jewish people, the children of Israel, land, seed, and blessing. And David, he makes another unconditional unilateral covenant set of promises. David wanted to build the temple. He had built his own house. Now he said it's time to build the temple of God. And Nathan comes in to him. Nathan is a prophet in the court, says, no, God does not want you to do that. You've been a man of war. Your son, Solomon comes from Shalom. Your son, Solomon, he will be the one who builds the temple. And so David, I love chapter 7, because David then goes into the tabernacle. He had brought the ark from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. And he goes in and worships. And God says to him, you want to build me a house? I'm going to build you a house. And he makes an unconditional, unilateral covenant promise to David. David, your dynasty will be an eternal dynasty. Your kingdom will be an eternal kingdom. Your throne will be an eternal throne. What a promise. And when the elders were going through this, we read David's prayer, David's praise to God, as he hears God make this promise to him. Awesome, unimaginable cluster of promises. David did something else, and I'll say more about that covenant next week and as we get into the prophets, so don't forget any of that. It was really interesting what David, the insight he has, because he's been in Hebron, which is the southern part of Judah, for 7 years as king. But he's got to unite all the other tribes, so he decides to send his general Joab to conquer the Jebusite city of Jerusalem. Joshua had not conquered that. And it's a great story, but Joab conquers the city of Jerusalem from the inside. It's incredible how he does that. And David makes Jerusalem the capital of his empire. You have a copy of this. This is a drawing of what the city of David looked like. Here was David's palace. By the way, this is a retaining wall. If you go to Jerusalem, that's still there. You can see that retaining wall. It's still there. Note Mount Moriah. That's where Abraham offered Isaac, was ready to offer Isaac to God. That will become very important because that's where the temple is going to be built by Solomon. So David makes Jerusalem the capital. Now it's really interesting he does that because that wasn't a part of any of the other tribes. It's neutral because it had been a Canaanite city. That becomes the capital, as you know. And so David accomplishes several things as this covenant promise. He establishes Jerusalem as the capital. And this just summarized again, it's in your booklet. He neutralizes the power of the Philistines. He established control of the Transjordan on the east side of the Jordan River, capturing the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites. They all pay tribute annually into the treasury of Israel. And he even conquers to the north, the Aramean kingdom that would be largely today what is Syria. And so the consequences of this map, which you have, here is the Davidic kingdom. From the Euphrates River all the way down to it's a wadi, this little river here that's on the border of Egypt. This is David's kingdom. Now notice, the Ammonites, the Moabites, Edomites, they're all part of the kingdom. They're paying annual tribute into David's treasury. This is the Aramean kingdom to the north. It's incredible. This is the golden age of Israel. Under David's monarchy, Israel becomes a major power in the Eastern Mediterranean world. And David makes a decision to move the ark to Jerusalem. And this, we've gone through the Davidic covenant, and I'll come back to this in just a minute. But what he does is he makes this decision. He decides to purchase. Now the lights are really bright, so you can't quite see. This is really a neat image here. But this was the threshing floor of Araunah. He was a Jebusite. He buys that. He buys that land from Araunah. He could have taken it, but he buys it. And he says, that's where we're going to build the temple. And in those last years of his life, he buys all the materials. He begins to organize. He contributes a lot of his own personal wealth to getting all the materials ready for his son Solomon to build the temple that he will do. We'll talk more about that next week. Now, I want to come back to this chart because this is all pointing to one of the major themes of the monarchy. David is a man after God's own heart. David is the king about which all the other kings of Judah, the southern kingdom, will be measured. But David's character flaw is evidenced in what he does with Bathsheba. And of course, her husband Uriah, whom he has in effect murdered, he sends him to the front under Joab. David tries to cover all this up. And Psalm 32 tells us the agony of what that year of cover-up for him was. But then in Psalm 51, David confesses his sin, and he's restored to his relationship with God. But the tragedy, of course, is he must live with the consequences of what he did. God forgives him. God restores him. But as a consequence of what he did, he sees 3 of his sons murdered. The third son, Absalom, leads a rebellion against him. He's murdered by Joab. Think of the consequences. But David walks with his God. He's restored. But he teaches us that sometimes we have to live with the consequences of the sin. Our relationship with God is restored. We enjoy that fellowship and intimacy with him. But sin has tragic consequences. So who is going to fulfill the covenant promise of an eternal throne, dynasty, and kingdom? What this chart does is it shows you how the line of David is connected to Jesus. Because the genealogies in Matthew and Luke show us how Jesus has the right to claim the Davidic throne. As a matter of fact, the argument of the book of Matthew is Jesus is the Davidic king. And the first 10 chapters are all the proof that Jesus has the right to claim the throne of David. So the monarchy that we're briefly reviewing today, and we'll talk about it next week with Solomon, is the monarchy is pointing us to Jesus. Because you just have lots of questions as you study all of this. How is God going to fulfill an unconditional covenant promise on an eternal throne, dynasty, and kingdom to David's descendants? When you leave the Old Testament, they are under the Persian Empire. There is no Davidic king ruling in Jerusalem. And you say, where is this Messiah, this Messiah, this anointed one, what the Greek language calls this Christ? Well, you open the New Testament, as I mentioned a moment ago, and you see it's Jesus. And Jesus is born in Bethlehem, the city of David. And all of those covenant promises come together with the rise, or I should say the appearance of Jesus. Born in Bethlehem to Mary, who is the covenant Son of God, the Son of God who will fulfill the Davidic promise. The questions that I have here at the end, and I'm really out of time here, I'm focusing particularly on the second and third bullets. As we study the monarchy, we can learn a lot about leadership. We can learn a lot about the importance of character and integrity and honesty and forthrightness and righteousness to God. Because indeed, leaders are always called to a higher standard. And the collapse of Saul is he didn't follow what God wanted in Deuteronomy 17. The measured success of David is he was serious about Deuteronomy 17. What about Solomon? If you want the answer to that question, you're going to have to come back next week.